To wrap up our series on the urinary system, we kind of need to deal with the rest of the urinary system, the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. Because up until now, it's been all about the kidneys, and the kidneys. So let's start with the ureters. The ureters are basically carrying urine from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. That's its only purpose. It's a tube to convey urine. It is retroperitoneal, which means it's behind the peritoneum. Now, if you remember the peritoneum back from digestion, we've already gotten to that one. But this is behind that membrane system. So looking at retroperitoneal. It's going to enter the urinary bladder at the posterior base. So the ureters come back and go behind the urinary bladder and come up from the back, from the posterior side. What's interesting though is they're going to allow those ureters to close as the pressure of urine inside the urinary bladder increases. Well, it kind of makes sense, because do you want urine going back up the ureters to the kidneys? No. So as the pressure increases inside the urinary bladder, the ureters will pinch closed to prevent backflow. So that's looking at the ureters. From a histology point of view, this is what we're seeing. Now, this is a cross-section through the ureter. What you're noticing is all of this little bit purplish color here, that is all transitional epithelial tissue. That transitional epithelium, if you remember, is meant to stretch or distend. All of this white area that's inside, that is the lumen of the ureter. Basically, that's where the urine will travel through. If you're thinking it's kind of collapsed, sure it is. As the urine travels through, it can open it up, allowing that transitional tissue to stretch or distend. And that's it. Ureter, done. It's literally just carrying the urine from the kidneys down to the urinary bladder. Which means we're on to the urinary bladder. In the case of the urinary bladder, muscular sac for temporary storage. That's literally all it is. It's a contained unit that holds urine and eventually releases urine. So this is a muscular sac because the muscles are going to contract when it's time to push the urine out. Again, it is retroperitoneal. Now in this case, it's not as much behind as it is behind and underneath, but not inside of the peritoneum, so it's outside. It's located just posterior to the pubic symphysis. So in pubic symphysis, go back to AP1, skeletal unit, where the coxal bones come together. That's the pubic symphysis in the front. But there is going to be a subtle anatomical difference here, male versus female. In the case of males, the prostate gland is going to ring around the inferior portion of the urinary bladder. It's basically causing a control mechanism going down to the urethra. And then in the female system, the actual urinary bladder is a little bit forward because it's anterior to the vagina and the uterus. So it's a little more forward in the female system, and you have the prostate in the male. But functionally, they do the same thing. There's still a sac that contains urine and then allows for urine to be excreted. The ureters both connect on the posterior side, male and female, so that's all the same. It's just anterior a little bit in the females. Males have the prostate. Now there are 3 distinct layers to the urinary bladder. The most internal layer, the one that's touching the actual urine, is transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelium, remember, stretch or distend. It's going to open up. It allows, as the urine fills, the urinary bladder to distend. Now, it's not unlimited. There is a limitation to how much it can stretch, but it can stretch quite a bit. The second one down here is this detrusor muscle. The detrusor muscle actually is 3 layers of smooth muscle. This is meant to contract, to expel the urine when you're actually going to the bathroom. So upon urination, the detrusor muscle contracts forcing the urine out. And the third one, fibrous adventitia. This is going to be a covering on the outside of the urinary bladder, kind of more protective and coating the outside. It's doing this everywhere except on the superior surface, because there you have peritoneum. Because the superior surface of the urinary bladder is touching the bottom of the peritoneum for the digestive system. So that surface, that superior surface, is actually peritoneum. So 3 different layers. For the most internal, that's your transitional epithelium. To the middle, which is your smooth muscle, your detrusor muscle. To the outside, adventitia, with the superior one being peritoneum. So here's what we're looking at for a histology of the urinary bladder. All of this is transitional epithelium, which means that can stretch, that can distend. Up here, this is where you'd have the urine. That would be the inside of the urinary bladder. That's the lumen. Now you can't see all the layers going out because this view is a little too close, but we wanted to really look at the transitional epithelium. In this case, this is all pulled together. The actual urinary bladder is pretty much empty at this point. As the urinary bladder fills, this transitional epithelium will straighten out, creating a straight edge as it stretches to accommodate all the urine. But once you go through micturition or urination, then the actual epithelial tissue contracts back because it's not needing to stretch out. That's your transitional. All right, urinary bladder. What we're looking at here, this is a female system. The way we know that is the short urethra. But for this purpose, everything else we're looking at is the same male or female. You have the ureters coming down the posterior side. Doesn't matter if it's male or female, that happens for both. They then are going to have these openings just inside there. That's where the urine is released into the urinary bladder. You're saying, well, it's on the bottom. That doesn't make sense. That's why as the urine goes in, the pressure closes or pinches that ureter, preventing backflow. You'll notice then right down here is where the urethra comes out. Those 3 pieces, the 2 openings of the ureter and the urethra, make that trigone area. Just that area sitting down there between the 3 openings. So that is the same, male or female. You have the same ureters, openings of ureters, you have the urethra opening, leaving the urinary bladder, and then you have the trigone area. Remember the differences, slightly was the female side, a little bit of an anterior shift because of the uterus. And the male system, you had the prostate gland circling around the opening of the urinary bladder on the inferior side, so the very bottom. Otherwise, urinary bladder functions the same way. Urine comes in, it's stored, urine goes out, and that's it. Which leaves us with the urethra. Now the urethra will vary a little bit, male versus female, changes at length. But the physical tissues and structure and function is pretty much the same. You're going to have mostly pseudostratified columnar epithelium. That makes up the majority of the lining of the urethra, except at the very beginning and the very end. At the very beginning, right where it comes out of the urinary bladder, we're looking at transitional epithelium. Makes sense, the urinary bladder is completely transitional epithelium. So just as it comes out, that little opening as it comes out is also transitional before it switches over to pseudostratified columnar. And then at the very end, stratified squamous epithelium. This is now what's found at the external urethral orifice. It's basically where the urethra opens up to the outside environment. You have the stratified squamous because it's more protective. The multiple layers, just like your skin, are more protective and prevent abrasions and damage. So while it's mostly pseudostratified columnar, you have a little bit of transitional, a little bit of stratified squamous. And then we have 2 urethral sphincters. We have an internal and external. The internal urethral sphincter is involuntary. You can't control it. What's happening here is it's going to contract to open when micturition or urination occurs. But you have no control. Your nervous system will say when it's time to control that. External urethral sphincter. This one you do have control over. The external urethral sphincter is a voluntary control system, which means you have to open both the sphincters for urination to occur though. So we have smooth muscle, involuntary, skeletal muscle, voluntary. When we're looking at the urethra, as I already mentioned, the length of the urethra will vary male and female. In the female system, looking at a shorter urethra. In the male system though, it's the length of the entire penis, so it's longer. So we have a different length. Urethra is longer in males, shorter in females. But it's the same function, carrying urine from the urinary bladder out of the system. So what is that? That's referred to as micturition. Micturition, known as urination, known as voiding, all three terms are the same thing. It's simply getting the urine out of the system. And it takes 3 simultaneous events for this to occur. 2 involuntary and 1 voluntary. First off, that detrusor muscle has to contract. Remember, that was made up of smooth muscle around the urinary bladder. So you have to contract the urinary bladder by the autonomic nervous system, the ANS. Second one, internal urethral sphincter has to open. So you have to contract that internal sphincter. That's also involuntary, and it's also by the autonomic nervous system. So both the detrusor muscle and the internal sphincter are both autonomic nervous system controlled, involuntary control. The voluntary control, which is by the somatic nervous system, is the external urethral sphincter. This one is a conscious process to open the sphincter. You're thinking, I've never in my life thought open external urethral sphincter. You don't have to. Simply thinking about urination automatically opens that sphincter. Your brain will interpret your thought of, oh, it's time to urinate, as I need to do this and open that up. So you don't have to consciously think of that sphincter, but you do have to think consciously of urination itself. Or at least your brain has to think you're thinking about urination. So we're looking at 3 simultaneous events, 2 involuntary, 1 voluntary, to allow for micturition to occur. So that's wrapping up the urinary system, from the ureters to the urinary bladder to the urethra, and finishing off with micturition or urination.